So thank you for inviting me to this, and congratulations on what seems to be a really fantastic project, and I hope it's going to be very successful. I come to this meeting with a slightly different background, so as was already explained, more from sustainability studies, biodiversity studies, and also perhaps a bit more from a science technology studies background. So what I'll do today is I'll share some of the maybe more theoretical underpinnings of the notion of co-production and why we actually do this, and there's different reasons for that. And I'll go over, pay most attention to some of the challenges that I have encountered in literature when it comes to these co-production approaches in the environmental domain. So first of all, when you come to this topic from a science and technology studies background, the one key reason why the move towards these approaches has been initiated is as a result of the problems of what has been called the linear model, which knowledge production by science is separate and independent from policy and society. And it is actually this separation that is also celebrated because it guarantees objectivity. And this objectivity is considered to be important for knowledge to be a good way to inform rational decision making. Now, as we probably all know, and is definitely the case in my field, this linear model is alive and kicking. It structures many of the interactions between knowledge production and decision making, even though it is also widely known and for a very long time that the model is flawed. So it's flawed both theoretically and practically in the sense that it doesn't work that way. So there's lots of objective knowledge, but there's also an abundance of a lack of rational decisions that shows that the relation between knowledge and action is really not straightforward. It doesn't automatically happen, and it doesn't happen as a result of the objectivity of the knowledge that is created. And another reason why the model doesn't work is that science is not separate from policy and society. It has historically been informed by societal and political priorities. So I show here the book that we've done for teaching purposes. I'm going to draw a couple of arguments from that book, which could be seen as a resource in science technology studies insights for knowledge action relations. So from STS, it's been for me, and this is different from the previous speaker, the origin of the notion of co-production is Sheila Jasanoff, who made this point about science and society and policy actually cannot be seen as separate in any way. And she talks about the co-production of science and social order in the sense that natural and social orders are being produced together with the knowledge we create about them. So it's more of a dialectical or a co-constitutive relationship, which also means that, that there is no practical separability between science and values, or between facts and values. They cannot be separate, which in no way means to suggest that all values are okay to allow knowledge production to be informed by. But the philosophical inseparability of facts and values is an important underpinning of the notion of co-production as advanced by Sheila Jasanoff. This also, and we see on the basis of the flaws of the linear model and the limitations, we see shifting science policy society relations across the board. captured by a lot of different concepts that maybe are slightly different in their meanings, also, like mode 2, post-normal science, transdisciplinarity, co-production, science policy interface studies to some extent also advance this. What they have in common is that they take the context of application and the demands of prospective users of knowledge very seriously, and they try to organize this by means of engagement and participatory approaches. So to engage or not to engage, which is a question that many scientists are struggling with, actually, I would argue that's not the question. We inevitably engage, and the question that matters is how. How do we do this in a way that results not just in effectiveness, but also in democratic legitimacy? So again, in our book, there's different ways to engage, and there's lots of different typologies of these ways, actually. In the book, we keep it quite simple, and we say, well, maybe you can distinguish 3 different ways of engaging as a knowledge producer with society and policy. And the first we call servicing, which is basically, what is your question and I'll answer it. The second is advocating, which is basically comes down to, this is what you should be doing. And diversifying, which is the core of the co-production or co-creation mode of working, is diversifying, opening up to include different values, forms of knowledge and perspectives. So the idea of co-production or co-creation, for the moment, I'd like to take them as sort of similar, is that you have a participatory approach to knowledge production, which actually tries to overcome the limitations of the linear model by linking knowledge to action. What is important is that in co-production, it's not the case of just designing solutions with a participatory approach. No, also the knowledge that underpins those solutions is created through a participatory approach and directly linked to the actions that might follow from this knowledge. So it considers the participants not just as stakeholders, but also as knowledge holders. Quite often, these processes are quite local and context specific. And I would emphasize there's an abundance of methodological guidance. What this methodological guidance mostly stresses is the importance of careful design and facilitation of these participatory spaces. And I listed an example here recently from the domain of sustainability by Albert Nordstrom, but there's lots of other things available. And I thought I would mention specifically the initiative that Gabrielle Bammer is running in Australia on what she calls integration and implementation sciences, which contains lots of blogs, lots of articles on how to do this well. So I hope that this is also useful for the context of public health. What I'm also reminded of is the notion of citizen science, where we see a lot of very similar debates. The idea of citizen science is also to produce knowledge together with people who are not normally seen as experts. Particularly in the biodiversity sphere, there's lots of initiatives and projects going on. But all of these processes have challenges. And to some extent, they draw from quite old, you could say, but quite important, I would still believe, studies of participation. Where, for example, Cook and Kothari, of course, has made famous the idea that participation is now the new tyranny, is the new preferred mode of oppression. And this is because participation often excludes in a lot of ways. It excludes stakeholders that cannot speak the lingo and don't have the right knowledge. that are considered unreasonable or unwilling to compromise, or that are unwilling to behave in the roles that have been afforded to them as holders of a specific stake or as consumers or clients. So what these studies show to some extent is actually that a participatory process strengthens the existing power inequalities that the participatory process paradoxically was meant to solve. But now the situation is arguably even worse because the outcomes have been legitimized with the participatory veil. Now, these lessons of how to do, of the problems of many participatory approaches have been known for a very long time, but have not been adequately addressed. And I'll try to show a little bit about why this is the case. So very similarly, also in our review of co-production approaches in the environmental domain, you see very similar challenges. You see the continued dominance of specific forms of accredited scientific or expert knowledge. You see that the creation of equal power relations often does not succeed. Scientists are still the ones who are seen to have the knowledge, and the other participants are still seen as the recipients or the implementers of the solutions that follow from these approaches. Now, to some extent, this is due to a drive to consensus, which excludes perspectives prematurely. So even when you have people at the seats, it doesn't mean that they can have a say. Other important problems of these approaches is that quite often impact stays within the project boundaries. So you see that a lot of co-production or co-creation processes are designed as pilot projects, for example. And almost by definition, the idea of a pilot is that it is isolated. So it stays within the box of these project boundaries, which to some extent is also the reason why it can happen in the first place. So it's almost by design detached from the wider political context, which of course restricts the contribution of these approaches to wider transformative changes that might be considered needed. So in order to address these very persistent problems of these processes, we have identified a couple of norms that at least the scientists, who are often the initiators or the facilitators of these co-creation approaches, can adhere to in order to prevent some of the risks that we have identified, but definitely not all of them. So accountability, first of all. If we accept that participatory approaches always exclude, it's not possible to be 100% inclusive, at least be accountable for the effects that these exclusions produce. What is absolutely crucial is to allow open and equal exchange, and particularly critique. So create a place for contestation, create a place for disagreement, and avoid the premature closing down by a drive for consensus or integration. And also important is, and this is where the methodological guidance that I talked about earlier comes in as very useful. Very important is an attitude or an ethic of humility, which can be fostered by using tools and methods that actively reduce, this would be my argument, the power of scientific and other forms of formalized expert knowledge. So echoing again ongoing discussions in citizen science, where I think there are a lot of similar innovations are also taking place. What is needed here is what has been called extreme citizen science, where you see that indeed has been echoed in other presentations before as well, where you have a participatory approach throughout the entire process, including talking about what the problem actually is and whose problem it is. I just copied here as a resource some of the principles that within the citizen science communities have been developed, which includes ethics of citizen sciences, just for further consideration. So what I'm arguing is that knowledge co-production can be an integral part of these adaptive and participatory interventions. And to avoid some of the risks that I've talked about, what is absolutely crucial is to open up the scope. To open up the scope for deliberation and co-production, where each of the questions, and this is not an exhaustive list that I highlighted here, have to be collectively decided upon. And while this seems logical, and you actually find this in a lot of these methodological guidances, you will also perhaps know that in practice, there's a lot of resistance against really opening up these questions. So again, from my experiences with the biodiversity community, for example, what the problem is and what matters are often defined by experts, and they're unwilling to let this go for quite good reasons, actually. And particularly perhaps the last one, what counts as success? So what will be the criteria against which effectiveness will be evaluated is also quite often expert dominated. So there is a sort of agreement that this is what's needed, but then again you will find with these same people that agree to co-production, that agree that this is important, you will also find that there's this resistance, and this resistance comes from professional norms on what is good science with how they're trained. It comes from how they're incentivized and evaluated. And it comes from norms about what the appropriate role of science in society is. So there's very good reasons for this resistance, which means that any effort to further foster co-production or co-creation approaches will need to carefully consider what the institutional and organizational obstacles are. To really push forward on this agenda and how to address them in order to avoid naive assumptions about people happily coming together and create things, and then the disappointment because of the reproduction of the challenges that have been so well documented in literature. So to conclude, and I hope I'm staying within my time, I'm never quite sure. There's 3 points of attention for in these co-production processes. Power, we've talked about this before. So be attentive to these unequal power relation and address them openly. You might not be able to solve them. Power equality is often an untenable and perhaps also an undesirable ideal. Not everybody has the same responsibility, and equally responsibilizing everyone has its own problems, but at least be attentive to them and try to justify them. Pluralism, so not just diversity and inclusion, but really make space to discuss and deliberate difference. Don't integrate it away. Don't allow consensus to overshadow the importance of difference. And then finally, which is actually the same point again, because these are about politics. So address the political dimensions of co-creation. Reflect on the inevitable in and exclusions that take place, and try as much as possible to engage the wider political context in which your co-creation or co-production process is situated. Now, this last point to me is relatively uncharted domain in the literature, as far as I can tell. And it's really also a challenge. So we have to recognize that these co-production, co-creation pilots or projects would not have been possible without this detachment from the wider political context. So in some of these circumstances, this is your only option. And it might stay within their box. And sometimes that's okay if a wider transformative agenda is not possible. But I've also grown to be increasingly suspicious that governments are creating space for these pilots as a way to not pursue more structural and institutional change. And if we allow ourselves to be co-opted in that agenda that actually aims to reproduce the status quo, then we are doing more harm than good. So it's really for me a dilemma, but I think that this requires more attention than that it currently often has in literature. All right, I'll close with that. Thank you very much.